Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about the differences between home sewing, industrial sewing, and haute couture sewing. I have some familiarity with each, having sewn at home on and off for a few years before enrolling in fashion school where I took classes in haute couture sewing and industrial sewing. That said, I have never worked in an haute couture atelier or an industrial sewing facility, so I'm not an expert. However, I have enough knowledge to give you a brief overview. Let's start by defining these terms, and I'll start with home sewing. Home sewing, or hobby sewing, is kind of the hardest to define because there are no set parameters. Basically, if you're doing it at home, you're not getting paid to do it, and you're not strictly using industrial techniques or haute couture techniques, then it's home sewing. Now let's move on to industrial sewing. Industrial sewing is the set of techniques and practices used in a production facility for mass production. Now, mass production just means anytime you're making more than one. It doesn't have to be like thousands of one item. It can be like 10 of one item of clothing. It just means you're making more than one. The goal with industrial sewing is to maximize speed and efficiency and minimize costs. Everything in the production facility is set up to achieve this goal. The equipment, from the irons to the cutting equipment to the sewing machines, is very specialized and efficient. Unlike home sewing machines, industrial sewing machines only have one function. Whether that's sewing in a button, doing a straight line, doing a zigzag, whatever it is, they only do that one thing, but they do it very, very well and really, really fast. In addition to the equipment, there are also slightly different techniques for putting clothes together in industrial, but I'll talk a bit more about that later. And finally, haute couture. Haute couture is actually a regulated term in France, and I'm going to quote the Business of Fashion's Fashion A to Z glossary. Haute couture is a much misused phrase that actually has very specific rules for qualifications. Members are selected by the Chambre syndicale de la haute couture. To qualify as an official haute couture house, members must design made-to-order clothes for private clients with more than one fitting using an atelier, workshop, that employs at least 15 full-time staff. They must also have 20 full-time technical workers in one of their workshops. Finally, haute couture houses must present a collection of no less than 50 original designs, both day and evening garments, to the public every season in January and July. So that's the official definition of what it means to be an haute couture house, but that doesn't really explain what couture sewing techniques are or what makes an haute couture garment so special. Haute couture is the pinnacle of craftsmanship. Garments are custom made for each client using the finest fabrics and very labor-intensive hand sewing techniques. That doesn't mean that they never use sewing machines, but the seams almost always get beautifully finished by hand. And given the exquisite and time-consuming nature of the sewing techniques, combined with the very fine fabrics and notions and trims used in haute couture garments, they come with a price tag to match. Think like hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, I'm going to be giving some examples of techniques used in the various types of sewing. So these techniques are not absolute, meaning that you might have someone who's a home sewist doing something the industrial way, or an industrial production facility might do something the home sewing way, or an haute couture way if they're using like a really fine and delicate fabric, etc. So take these examples with a grain of salt. Let's start with how sewing lines, notches, darts, and other notations get marked. Home sewists will often use a tracing wheel and chalk paper to mark in the sewing lines, darts, and other important notions that they need in order to sew the garments. In haute couture, however, these lines are basted in by hand. Talk about time consuming. I truly hate actually haute couture for this reason. There's so much basting, like it literally made me want to throw my projects out the window, and that's why I stopped studying it. Don't get me wrong, I think haute couture is amazing when other people do it. In industrial, you don't mark the sewing lines at all. You cut a little notch to represent the seam allowance, so if the notch is half an inch away from the raw edge, then that means that the seam allowance is half an inch, and then you eyeball it and sew half an inch the whole way down. Same goes for other notches. You make a little cut into the seam allowance, and that's how you know where to line things up. Darts, which are these triangle-looking things that create shape in a garment, are really fun in industrial. You clip two little notches at the top where the dart starts, and then about half an inch from the end of the dart, you literally stab a hole into the fabric using an awl and then sew past it. Now, some home sewists probably do use this method to save time, and conversely, in an industrial setting, if the fabric is really delicate, you'd probably use like either chalk or basting to mark the lines. But one thing is certain, you would never use the industrial method in haute couture. Stabbing a hole through that precious fabric? Nuh-uh. Next, we're going to talk about setting in sleeves. For those who don't know what that is, when you're attaching the sleeve to the armhole of a garment, the sleeve part actually has to be longer or bigger than the armhole in order to allow for movement. unless you're working with really stretchy fabrics, which is different. So in order to fit the larger sleeve cap into the smaller armhole, you need to gather the fabric. Home sewists generally do this in the same way that tailors or haute couture ateliers would do this, or my understanding of how they do it anyway, which is by sewing 2 parallel rows of stitching and then spacing out the gathers by hand so that they're even. In industrial, they have a faster way of doing it. One of my sewing teachers, who owns her own production facility, told us, in production, we do not have time for that, and she showed us this technique instead. Instead of sewing 2 lines of gathering stitches, you take the thread out of the sewing machine and then you stitch between the notches without thread at the seam allowance line, and you hold the fabric like this so that it bunches up, and that's how you gather it. Wild, right? Again, in some situations they probably wouldn't do this because certain fabrics wouldn't hold those gathers very well, or they might be too delicate, but in any case, I thought it was a cool trick. Okay, the final thing I'm going to talk about is seam finishes. Seam finishes are when you do something to the raw edge of the fabric so that it doesn't unravel or look messy. For home sewists, this is likely going to depend on what they have on hand. I personally like finishing all my seams with a serger, but not everybody who sews has one. Other methods of finishing seams that are used by home sewists include using pinking shears, doing a zigzag stitch on the sewing machine, or binding the raw edges with fabric, sometimes called the Hong Kong finish. Flat felled seams, French seams, and self-bound seams are also possible. In industrial, the most common form of seam finish is probably serging. It's fast and therefore it's cheap, and it looks pretty nice. That said, pretty much any seam finish the client wants, which is going to depend on the fabric they're using, their design intent, and their price point, can be used in industrial. The only seam finishes that would not really be used, as far as I'm aware, are like pinking shears and most hand-sewn finishes. Like, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I'm pretty sure no one at an industrial production facility is out here like cutting the individual seam allowances of every garment using pinking shears. As a general rule, any seam finish that needs to be done by hand and is very slow is quite unlikely to be used in an industrial setting. Conversely, in haute couture, seams are typically finished by hand. There is no serging. However, according to this book, Couture Sewing Techniques by Claire B. Schaefer, apparently some houses do a tiny zigzag stitch by machine to finish seams. According to Claire's book, the most common types of seam finishes are hand overcasting, which is basically doing like these tiny diagonal stitches all along the fabric to finish the raw edge, or binding, which I explained before, when the raw edge is enclosed in a thin strip of fabric. Other seam finishes are of course possible, but the key is that they are done by hand and that they either look inconspicuous or they look beautiful and add to the design. Alright, that is all for today. If you want to learn more about haute couture, I'd highly recommend checking out Claire Schaefer's book, Couture Sewing Techniques, or checking out Loïc Prigent's YouTube channel. Loïc is a French YouTuber who films behind the scenes of the fashion industry, and I've linked one of his videos about the Chanel haute couture ateliers below. If you want to learn more about industrial, I'd highly recommend either taking a class at your local fashion school, they typically teach industrial methods, or checking out Zoe Hong's channel where she talks about everything fashion from the perspective of a fashion designer with many years of experience in the industry. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.